We're going to be thinking this morning about the subject of sexual modesty in dress. I've been asked to speak on this subject by our elders. I say that not to embarrass them or to place the blame for this lesson upon them, but to let you know that Gary Henry is not the only person who believes we need to hear some things about this at Broadmoor. The elders have asked not only me, but Jeremy and Mike also to give some thought to this subject, so you may be hearing from the other two men as well as time goes along. It's certainly a difficult subject to study and to speak on, but I verily believe this is an area where, as creatures of the culture in which we live, that many of us are selling our souls in order to fit in to the world around us. I don't, of course, expect unanimous agreement to anything that I will say this morning, but I do ask you to hear me out, at least to give what I'm going to try to say a fair hearing. This is a very important subject, and not only important, I would say it is an urgent subject. First of all, because of the prevalence of sexually immodest dress in the culture around us. We are living in a world that very much reminds me of the statement that was made in Isaiah's day, chapter 5 and verse 20, where the text said, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." We're living in a day when, in regard to everything concerning sexual conduct, the rules have been reversed. Things have been turned inside out and upside down so that the norms in our day would be considered very shocking by cultures even fairly recently in the history of the world. We live in a time that also reminds me of Paul's statement in Philippians 3:19, where he talked about those whose glory is in their shame. We have almost in our culture lost the ability to blush. And that which is shameful is not only accepted, in many cases it has become the things that people glory in, the things that they are proud of. Because of what's happening in the culture around us, there is an increasing problem among Christians. We live in the world, and while we strive not to be of the world, our culture rubs off on us. And we need not be so naive as to think that problems in the world are not going to impact our thinking. So those of us who are Christians need to give some thought to this subject. The number one reason why I think this subject needs to be talked about is because of the impact of cultural trends and congregational trends on our young people. Whatever affects our young people ought to be a very serious concern to us. And so I believe this is a subject that it was right for our elders to ask for some teaching time to be devoted on in our congregation. Let me say, first of all, that I understand that there is more than one kind of immodesty. We're going to be speaking about sexual immodesty in dress, but I understand that there's more to the subject of modesty than that. We could be immodest in our speech and our behavior, as well as our dress. We might be showy or ostentatious in our dress, as well as sexually provocative. But while all of these other aspects of the subject of modesty are important and maybe need to be taught on in other occasions, the subject of sexual immodesty in our dress is our subject this morning. I also understand that this is a matter of the heart and not just a question of clothing. Certainly it doesn't do any good to dress modestly if your heart is not modest. But I also understand that it doesn't do any good to have a modest heart if you don't do anything about that in your actions. And it is possible to be very modest in one's heart and simply not see the extent to which we're being sexually immodest in our dress. And I understand also that this is not just a woman's subject. It's possible for a man to be sexually immodest in his dress. The fact of the matter is that the Scriptures pay more attention on this subject to the woman's side of the question. And I would suggest that if you don't know why that is, somebody needs to sit down and talk with you a little bit about the birds and the bees. There are some very obvious reasons, if you know anything about men and women, why this particular subject needs to be talked about specifically with regard to women's clothing. But I understand all of these clarifications, that what we're talking about this morning is not the only kind of immodesty, and that we're not just talking about clothing, and that this is not just a woman's subject. I understand all of these things. Nevertheless, we need to talk about this question. And I want to begin by going to the Old Testament, to a passage in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 and 7, where in the law of Moses we find these words, "None of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness." And that phrase, uncover one's nakedness, appears in those two verses and many times in the verses that follow in that passage, as well as in other places in the Old Testament. This is, of course, talking about sexual intimacy. The phrase to uncover one's nakedness means to have sexual intercourse with that person. It's what is literally being talked about there. But it is interesting, isn't it, that God described sexual intimacy as an uncovering of someone's nakedness. The point of that is the command not to uncover somebody's nakedness that you don't have a right to be uncovering means that nakedness normally would be covered. Be no point in God saying, don't do that, if nakedness were not normally covered. In regard to nakedness, I want to suggest that there are two separate sins even within the context of this passage. It would be wrong for me to uncover someone's nakedness who's not my wife. And that's what this passage is about. You don't uncover the nakedness of somebody who is not your spouse. But that also implies that it would be sinful for me to uncover my nakedness to someone who is not my spouse. And that's the aspect of the subject that we want to talk about this morning. In Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 19, Solomon said, warning the young man not to seek sexual pleasure with someone other than his wife, said, "As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breasts satisfy you at all times. Always be enraptured by her love." Again, you can look at that in two different directions. He's saying, let your wife's breasts satisfy you. But he's also saying, let her breast satisfy you and only you. No one but you as a husband have the right to enjoy even the visual joy of your wife's breasts. That's for you and her in private. And his warning is, that ought to be enough. Enjoy your wife's breasts and not some other woman's. But for the wife, that would also say, let your husband be the only person who enjoys your breasts. And breasts there simply figuratively referring to the body as a whole. Wife's body is for her husband's enjoyment. His body is for her enjoyment. And it must stop there. And even by visual hint or suggestion, the sexual parts of the body are not to be enjoyed by anybody except a person's husband or wife. Now let me make a point that some of you understand, but some of you apparently don't. And that is that men, when it comes to sex, are visually stimulated. It doesn't take any more than a visual image to arouse a man sexually. It's a generalization, of course, and there are exceptions to all generalizations. But anybody who knows anything about men and women understands that in comparison to women, men are more aroused by visual stimuli. That's exactly why pornography is more of a problem for men than it is for women. Not to say that it's not any problem for women, but generally speaking, men would more apt to be aroused by looking at a picture or a visual image. And that's why women's dress is so important. Because it has to do with what a man sees. And what a man sees has a great deal to do with whether he is sexually aroused or not. Not only are men more aroused by visual stimuli, men are more quickly aroused by any stimulus sexually. It is true that if women are ovens, men are microwaves. Ladies, it doesn't take much visually for a man to be sexually aroused. If you don't understand that, then somebody needs to sit down and talk with you a little bit about the birds and the bees. So we need to understand that about the way God created us. God made men the way they are, to be aroused visually, but He made them so that their wives would arouse them visually and no one else. To allow that to take place outside the marriage relationship is to give to someone else what they have no right to be enjoying, even visually. Now, with regard to the eyes, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 14 talks about those having eyes full of adultery and that cannot cease from sin. There certainly are people like that. Certainly a lot of men like that, whose eyes are full of adultery. Yes, there is a certain type of man who has a dirty mind. And he can't look at any woman, no matter how she's dressed, without thinking sexual thoughts. There are men like that. But ladies, this morning, that's not the man we're concerned about. Nothing we're going to do is going to be able to help him govern his thoughts. We're talking about the visual effect that your clothing has upon a godly man. A man who's making heroic efforts to keep his heart pure. A man who's trying as hard as anybody can not to be aroused visually by the sight of anyone other than his wife. The tendency on the part of some women, I think, is to assume that they can dress sexually, but that if anyone looks at them and thinks sexual thoughts, then he's got a dirty mind. And that is nothing but naive. Sexually attractive dress produces sexual thoughts in any man's mind, even the most godly. And so let's not just wave this subject aside by saying if I dress sexually, it's my business, and anybody who looks at me and thinks sexual thoughts has a dirty mind. No, any man who looks at you, if you're dressed in a sexually attractive way, is going to think the same thoughts that any other man is going to think, because that's the way men have been made by God. Let's think a little bit about the word attraction. Before you say, I just want to dress attractively, let's stop and think about that a little bit. There's a sense in which that would be a perfectly innocent statement, but think with me. The word attract comes from a compound Latin word that meant literally to draw or to pull in the direction of. And the meaning of the English word is to cause something to draw near, to pull toward. We've got a new Star Wars movie coming out, don't we? Was it in Star Wars that we had the tractor beam? Is that in Star Wars or something? What was the tractor beam? That was a force field that if you got into it, it pulled you in to the satellite or the battle station or whatever. That family of words always has to do with pulling something. A tractor is something that draws or pulls something behind it. Traction is the grip that allows something to have some pull, to pull in the direction of something. So to attract means to draw or to pull something. Now the word attractive in regard to clothing and even our general personal appearance can be used in a general sense and also a specific sense. Generally, and sometimes harmlessly, it simply means to dress in a way that is pleasing to the eye or mind. The word charming would be a good synonym there. Not anything wrong with drawing attention to oneself in that way, even though even there we need to be careful. But the specific sense means having the power to attract or to pull someone's attention in one's own direction. Now, that being true, attractive clothing draws or pulls attention of some kind. Now, the thing that you are drawing attention to about yourself may be very honorable, may be perfectly harmless. Depends on what it is. A week ago yesterday, I went over to Shane's Rib Shack and had some great ribs with my good friend Lee Wildman, who was in town for the afternoon, and I just happened to have on my moon pie t-shirt when we went over there. Well, that's an attractive shirt if I ever saw one. in the literal sense, that it draws attention to the fact that I like moon pies. I got several comments on it in the restaurant, some quite humorous. But that illustrates the point that attractive clothing in this strict sense means that it draws attention to something about you. Now, if it is sexual attention that you are drawing to yourself, that's a very serious matter if we're talking about somebody other than your spouse. So is our clothing sexually attractive? Is there anything about it that would draw someone's sexual attention to you other than your spouse? If you're married, listen to me, if you're married, you shouldn't be drawing sexual attention to yourself. With the single exception of your spouse, your husband. And if you are not married, you don't need to be using sex to attract the attention of a potential spouse. Let me tell you, the man you'll get with that kind of a bait is a man you're going to be disappointed with long term. So whether you're married or unmarried, the use of clothing to attract sexual attention in oneself is a very, very serious matter. I would say this to our unmarried young ladies. Keep sex out of the picture as much as you can in your dealings with young men until you get married. You can keep it out of sight as much as you want to, and you'll still engage the sexual interests of prospective suitors. And you don't have to worry about that. But diminish it. Keep it out of sight as much as you can. What you want to attract with are the qualities about you that you want him primarily to be interested in. So try to keep the rest out of you as much as you can. And if you're going to draw or pull attention, let it be drawing or pulling attention to something about you that you really want them primarily to be interested in. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9 and 10, where Paul talks about modesty, but in this passage he's not talking about sexual modesty, just social modesty. He says that a woman would be far better if she's going to attract, to be attractive in terms of her spiritual qualities, her character. That the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but that which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. So women, my advice to you, young unmarried women, you're going to attract, you're going to exert a pulling force of prospective mates. Make sure that the magnet you're using draws them to your godliness first and foremost, and other things will take due course. Now, in Proverbs chapter 7 and verse 10, passage that Phil Robertson studied with us during the meeting a couple of weeks ago, it says there a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. What would you say the attire of a harlot is? Well, it's not clothing that says, I'm a prostitute. The attire of a harlot is clothing that attracts sexual interest to yourself. Now, that's not my definition. That is the definition of an actual prostitute that I had the opportunity to talk to for about 2 hours a number of years ago. Clarify immediately, she was off duty. A number of years ago when I lived in Las Vegas, Nevada, a state where in all but 2 counties prostitution is legal, I was getting ready to get on the bus to go to Reno, Nevada for that weekend, late Friday afternoon. As I was standing in line waiting to get on the bus, there was a young couple in front of me. They had wedding rings on, so I presumed that they were married. And I thought they both would be getting on the bus. But as we got to the door of the bus, they kissed goodbye. He left, she got on the bus, and then I followed. And as we made our way down the aisle, I found myself sitting next to this woman. The 2-hour bus ride to where she was going to be getting off. And you know how it is in those kind of situations. You say, well, where are you going? Where are you from? And what do you do? Well, I told her what I did. At that time I was working in the publishing business and preaching part-time. And she said, during the week, I work in an office in Las Vegas, but on weekends I work up at Lida Junction. Well, I've been through Lyda Junction a number of times, and I knew that there was not much there but a stoplight, just one intersection, but there was a brothel at that intersection. And I said, "You work at Lyda Junction?" She said, "Yes. On the weekends, I'm a prostitute." Well, I took advantage of that opportunity to just pepper her with questions for the next 2 hours, things I wanted to hear from the perspective of a person who did her kind of work. And so I said, "Are you familiar with that passage in Proverbs chapter 7, verse 10, where it talks about the attire of a harlot?" She said, "Yeah, I've heard about that a lot." I said, what do you think is the attire of a harlot?" She said, "Well, it's not the stereotype of loud, gaudy colors and big hair and lots of mascara." She said, "Some of us in the business cater to a higher priced clientele, and that would not attract anybody." She said, "Depending on what niche your market is in," she said, you will dress in a way to attract their sexual interest. She said the attire of a harlot is clothing that attracts sexual interest. It pulls people in to your force field of sexual attraction. And so I asked her, I said, based on your experience, if you wanted to draw sexual attention to yourself or sexual attention to a particular part of your body, what would you do? And here's what she told me. Here's how you draw attention to a certain part of your body. Not from a gospel preacher, not from a godly woman, but from a woman who has a vested business interest in knowing how this works. First of all, you could reveal it, just uncover it. She said that's usually the least effective way. She said total human nudity is usually pretty repulsive. She said, but you can't reveal what you want to arouse interest in. The opposite of that is, she said, you can conceal it and reveal everything else. That's the bikini effect, where the only things that are covered are the things that attention is drawn to by virtue of the fact that everything else is uncovered. She said, you can reveal just a little bit of it. Give a hint or a preview, a tantalizing glimpse of something. She said, you can cover it tightly so that the form of whatever's underneath of it is clearly revealed, even though it's covered. Or she said, you can cover it thinly. She said, that's the most provocative to most men. You cover it, but with such thin, filmy material that you can see through it, or if not see through it, clearly see the form of that which is underneath. Well, she gave me that list. I said, you know men pretty good. She said, it's my business to know men. She worked on commission, and in a brothel situation, a man would come into the building, into a lobby area, and there would be a number of girls there that he could pick from. So she's got to compete with her co-workers. She's got to be dressed in such a way as to attract the sexual attention of men who walk through the front door. So I asked her, I said, I find many of my religious sisters dressing in ways very similar to what you've just described. They apparently don't know that that arouses the sexual interest of men. And I asked her, I said, why do you think it is that religious women are sometimes so clueless about how men's minds work? She thought a little bit and she said, well, I expect a lot of them know more about that than they're letting on like they know. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to live in both worlds, and so they just deny that they know how this works. But she said, I'm sure many of them really don't know how men's minds worked. And she said the reason for that is probably that they were never taught anything about sex by anybody other than their mothers. Let me tell you, if all you know about how the mind of the opposite sex works is what you learned from your same-sex parent, you're clueless. And she said, if your religious women have not had it explained to them by a man how this works, they probably don't know, even if their mothers tried to teach them. Well, are we wearing sexually attractive clothing? The response of many of you would be to say, well, yes, I suppose so in a technical sense, but I'm not wearing it for that reason. And so, shame on anybody from looking at me and thinking those thoughts, because that's not why I'm wearing it. Well, as a man, let me just explain to you the facts of life here. As far as men are concerned, sexually attractive clothing has the same effect whether that was your intent or not. Your intent really has very little to do about it in terms of my response when I see you visually. You wear sexually attractive clothing, men are going to be sexually attracted, whether that's what you want to happen or not. It has that effect not just on men with dirty minds, but on every man who sees you, including the ones who are trying their hardest to think pure thoughts. Clothing sends signals of all different kinds. You understand, I'm sure, that when it comes to communication, there is verbal communication and there is nonverbal communication. By almost everything we say or do, we are sending signals, either verbally or nonverbally, that somebody is receiving. In the case of visual signals, those signals are being sent to everybody who sees us. It's possible, of course, to send sexual signals by our clothing that we don't intend, and maybe they were not even aware of. But the signals are still being sent, and they're still being received by red-blooded men. Years ago, a gospel preacher who was a friend of mine went with his wife to Norway to preach the gospel for several years. And they got to Norway, they noticed that the brethren over there were very standoffish toward his wife. Come to find out, she was wearing earrings. And in Norway, earrings send a sexual signal that no godly woman would want to be sending. She immediately took them off and didn't wear them anymore the whole time she was over there. There was a case where she was sending signals that she didn't realize she was sending. Now, she thought, like a lot of our sisters think, she just said, well, there's nothing inherently wrong with earrings, and it's my right to wear them, and I'll wear them, and they just need to govern their thoughts when they look at me. No. Actions send signals, and we're responsible for the signals we send. And we don't understand all the signals that we're sending by the way we dress. We need to ask somebody for an objective opinion who can help us to understand what signals we're sending. Clothing is one of the ways that we identify ourselves with groups of people. And the question becomes, who is it that I want to identify myself with? I'm afraid some of us, our primary objective is to identify ourselves with the popular people and with the cool people, rather than with godly people. Now, there's not always a choice that has to be made between those two. Sometimes you can dress in a very godly fashion, it be very cool, and you be a very popular person at school. But if a choice has to be made, if identifying myself with God's people would require me to wear something that I found hideously ugly, I'm going to tell you, I would sacrifice my personal taste to be identified with the people that I want to be identified with. And I would avoid clothing that would identify me with anybody other than that when a choice had to be made between the two. Ladies, sometimes we're inconsistent. We wear clothing that sends sexual signals, but we resent it when somebody responds. Several weeks ago, I was in a bank, and the teller was dressed so immodestly, I could not have looked below eye level and seen anything that wouldn't have attracted my sexual attention. And I'm trying, as a male, not to look at her bosom, but I was not entirely successful, and she noticed it, and she said, "You got a problem with my breasts?" I said, "Ma'am, I'm trying not to look, but you got them on public display. How can you advertise and not, and only want certain customers? Because I'm a member of the public. You got them on public display. So I'm trying, but I'm not entirely successful." She wasn't very pleased with my response. Wearing clothing that is sexually attractive, ladies, you may as well hang a sign around your neck that says, "I'm open for business." That's what that says. If it's anybody but your husband, you ought not be saying that. I was raised in Mississippi where we had a lot of old black blues singers. One of the old black blues men in Mississippi had a song that said, "If you ain't going to sell me no bacon, don't you go opening up the store." But that's exactly what we do when we dress sexually attractively, and then we act like we're indignant when anybody is sexually attracted, as if we only want some people to see that. Now, we can't have it both ways at once. So let's go back to our little chart and what this prostitute told me about how you would dress if you wanted to draw sexual attention to a certain part of your body. Let's go through this list with regard to our own clothing. You could reveal that which you wanted a man to be sexually interested in. I've seen too many outfits in this auditorium, ladies, that reveal too much skin, such that it makes it nearly impossible for me to look at you and not think sexual thoughts. And I realize that in our culture, and especially with the onset of warm weather, skin is in. And outfits that don't reveal a lot of skin are not going to be perceived as being very cute. But if you reveal so much of the skin on your body that as a man I can't look at you and not think sexual thoughts, then you've got a problem, I've got a problem, we've got a problem. But the prostitute said you can conceal it and reveal everything else, and that would still draw attention to it. And I think that's exactly what swimsuits do, especially two-piece swimsuits. By covering only a very limited area of the body, they draw attention to the very areas that are being covered. Or you could reveal just a little bit of it. Men are easily tantalized, engaged by a preview or a glimpse or a hint of something. That's what a short skirt does. It provides a glimpse of the thigh, and thighs are very sexually attractive to men, so even a glimpse of it will arouse a man's sexual interest. Jeans that have such a low waist that when you bend over, it gives men a peekaboo look at your lower back. Give men a glimpse of something that nobody but your husband needs to be seeing. What about cleavage? Let's talk about that. Ladies, if you give me even the tiniest glimpse of your breasts, I'll be aroused sexually as a man. And no man but your husband has a right to enjoy even a preview, even a hint of your breasts. And I know that cleavage is popular from a stylish standpoint. From the standpoint of a man who's trying to keep his mind pure, I'm telling you, and the rest of the guys in the room would back me up if they'd be honest, any cleavage is too much for anybody other than your husband. Or we could cover it tightly. Whether it's your rear end or your crotch or your breasts. I would put what many would consider to be modest swimsuits into this category. Even if they're not two-piece, they cover more than that. What they cover so tightly that it leaves nothing to the imagination as far as a man goes. Tight jeans and pants that are so tight. Put me in mind of that country song by Trace Atkins a few years ago about the honky-tonk badonkadonk, about the woman who wondered how she even got in them britches. They look, they're tight enough that they leave nothing to the imagination. They reveal the form of everything that they cover so clearly. While being covered, they reveal the form of it that a man doesn't have to exercise a very great leap of imagination to know what you look like from the waist down. Or tight tops. Women, if your top is so tight that I can clearly see the outline of your breasts, you've got a problem, I've got a problem, we've got a problem. Very often sweaters fall into this category, or knit tops that are so tight that from the vantage point of a man, he can easily visualize what your breasts look like. Or cover it thinly. I've seen too many white tops in this auditorium that clearly let me see your bra, ladies. If that happens, then you've got a problem, I've got a problem, we've got a problem. Tops made out of such thin material that I can see your nipples. And I've seen that in this building. Pants thin enough that I can tell what kind of underwear you got on. You got a thong on, I can see it clearly because the fabric of your slacks is so tight and so thin that it shows what kind of underwear you've got on. Well, to repeat, as far as men are concerned, these things draw attention to certain parts of your body, whether that was your intent or not. The effect is still the same sexually. When you wear these kinds of clothing, listen to me, you are initiating a sexual transaction. even if it's mental, even if it's visual. You are initiating a sexual interaction that you don't need to be doing with anybody but your husband. And any train of events, whoever initiated the train of events has the greater blame. We read many Bible stories that make that point, don't we? Balaam, who taught Balak, the king of the Midianites, how to undo the Israelites by seducing their women to enter with them into their, the Midianite women, to seduce the Israelite men to enter into their pagan sacrifices with them. Israel committed horrible sin when they did that, but Balaam had the greater blame because he set that up and taught Balak how to get them to do that. Jezebel, who had such an insidious effect on her husband, Ahab. Doesn't mean he was guilt-free, but she had the greater guilt because she stirred him up to do those things. 1 Kings 21, verse 25 said. Or Jeroboam, 1 Kings 14, verse 16, where it says he made Israel to sin by the gold calves that he set up. Nearly every time I say to somebody, you made me mad, they'll say, no, I didn't make you mad. Nobody can make you mad. You make yourself mad. Well, I understand the point that's being made there, but the Bible very frequently talks about people making other people do other things. And 1 Kings 14, verse 16 said Jeroboam made the people of Israel engage in idolatry. He did that by initiating that chain of events. In the New Testament, we read Jesus in John 19, verse 11, saying to Pilate, who had asked Jesus, don't you know that I've got the right to put you to death? Jesus said, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. The Jews had initiated that course of action, and while Pilate was not guiltless, theirs was the greater sin. Or Peter, in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 and following, who played the hypocrite, and even Barnabas and the other Jews were influenced by what he did, so he had great blame. Can we fail to apply that to sexually attractive clothing? Ladies, you dress in a sexually attractive way, and be prepared for the consequences of men who may not just think things, but have so little restraint that they're going to want to act on them, even when you don't want them to. We live in a culture where freedom and spontaneity are worshipped. And I'm going to tell you, in that kind of environment, ladies, you better be very careful what you wear. There's a growing problem of date rape in our culture. I was flying back from California several years ago to Indianapolis and found myself sitting next to a ponytailed lawyer from California. He was flying to Indianapolis to try a date rape case. His client was the young woman. She'd been raped on a date where he admitted both of them had gotten drunk at a frat party, but she ended up getting raped, and now they charged the young man with rape, and this attorney was the young woman's lawyer. And when I asked him, just asked him, what did she have on? I thought he was going to turn himself out. I thought he was going to hit me right there on the plane. That doesn't have anything to do. Well, legally, no. If he raped somebody, he's guilty. Then legally, it doesn't make a difference what she did or what she was wearing. But from her standpoint, certainly from God's standpoint, she created a problem for herself. She created a very serious sin if what she had on initiated that chain of events. It may have been that she could have avoided being raped that particular night by having something different on than what she did. When it comes to our impact, our influence on others, we very often want to have it both ways, don't we? We want to take credit for good impact, but we want to deny any responsibility for bad impact. And you can't have one of those without the other. If we're going to initiate a train of thought or a train of action, might go to Titus chapter 2 and verse 10, where Paul said that we ought to adorn the doctrine of God our Savior. Dress and act in such a way that the chain of thoughts and events that come from that are those that will be desirable and those that would honor God and even draw people, attract people to the gospel. Well, we obviously are talking about the heart here, aren't we? Jesus said in Luke 6:45, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. So our speech, our behavior, including things like our clothing, that does come from the heart. Modesty is essentially a character trait. But listen to me, and listen to me well. While we need to make sure that our heart is where it needs to be with respect to God, It's also a fact that we need to make sure that our outward conduct is consistent with the godly, modest heart that we believe we have. We may be dressing immodestly despite our godly heart simply because we don't see it. It's in our blind spot. We've been so programmed by our culture to think that certain things are okay, we just don't see how sexually attractive they are. If that be the case, then we need somebody to help us to see that as it is. Wives, your husbands could help you see how other men see you in public. Daughters, your dad could help you see more about this than your mom could. If you don't have a dad or a father who can help you see this, go to one of our elders and ask them for help. Or ask me. I'll sure tell you whether what you're wearing is sexually attractive or not. But anytime we teach on this subject, we get a lot of objections, don't we? So let me briefly go through some of these. A lot of people will say, well, this is just a matter of the heart. Externals don't matter. Well, I guess they do. Wives, what happened next time your birthday, your anniversary, or Valentine's Day comes around, and you don't get any gift, you don't get any flowers, you don't get any card, and you ask that husband of yours why, and he said, well, honey, love is just a matter of the heart. Externals don't have anything to do with it. You'd say, yeah, right. Externals have a lot to do with it. What's going on in the heart needs to go on if it's godly, but it needs to show up in outward behavior as well. It's too hard to find modest clothes, and that's often true in our society, but difficulty is no excuse. I seem to remember Jesus saying that it would be difficult. The way is narrow and the way is difficult that leads to heaven. And so what were we expecting except that it would be difficult? A lot of our younger women simply think that modest clothes are outdated and ugly. And that may be true in many cases. You just don't like those kind of clothes. But I'll go back to the point I made earlier. If identifying with the Lord's people required me to wear something that was hideously ugly, I believe I'd make the sacrifice of personal taste to wear it in order to send the right signals. Let's use an arbitrary example. Let's just suppose in a weird world that all of the godly people wore shirts that were the most hideous, ugly green that you've ever laid your eyes on. And you hate green to start with. But in that world, everybody who's godly wears that hideous shade of green. You don't like it. What would you do if you had your head on straight? You'd put aside your personal preference and wear that hideous green in order to identify yourself with the people that you want to be identified with. Personal taste really doesn't have much to do with it. Now, that said, it is obviously true that many times there's not a choice between the two. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The one I get the most is it's men who have the problem. They should just control their thoughts. And ladies, that is simply beside the point. Nobody but your husband has the right to visually enjoy your body. And if you're giving glimpses or previews in any shape, form, or fashion of your body to anybody other than your husband, it doesn't matter who the men are out there, whether they have dirty or clean minds, the effect is still the same on them. Nobody but your husband has a right to be seeing that. Styles change, somebody says. Modesty is culturally determined. Well, what is considered modest certainly changes with society, but I'm telling you, male sexual drive doesn't change much from generation to generation. It pretty much stays the same. And there will be limits to what will be accepted even by society. Remember years ago when I first started going to the little island of Dominica down in the Caribbean preaching, I explained to my wife at that time that in Dominica, many of the women go topless. But I said, it's just culture, so don't worry about it. She said, yeah, right. You better not be looking, bud. Well, the fact that it's accepted by their culture doesn't mean that it's not immodest, because male sexual drive is still the same regardless of the culture. It's a matter of judgment, somebody says. Where do you draw the line? Well, you'd have more of an argument there if we were talking about social modesty, the difference between something being too showy or ostentatious. Those are harder lines to draw sometimes. We might seek a wise person's help if we're having trouble drawing those lines. But let me tell you, the line between sexual modesty and immodesty is easy to draw. And if you don't, ladies, know where to draw it, ask a man. You draw that line in a bat of an eye by telling you whether a certain visual image is sexually provocative to him or not. The line is not nearly as hard to draw as we might pretend that it is. Somebody says, yes, but there are exceptional situations. Weddings, banquets, swimming events, and massage parlors, and all of the rest. Exceptional situations where apparently we think that the rules just don't apply. It begins to look like the only place that we think the rules do apply is in areas that we just don't care very much about. But if here's an area where I want to do something, I'm not going to let God stand between me and what I want to do. I'll tell you, weddings are a special problem for me as a gospel preacher. I've gotten to where I just almost won't do a wedding because the wedding dresses have become so immodest that I have a harder and harder time positioning my Bible between my eyes and the bride's bosom. Brides, a few hours from that wedding ceremony, your husband is going to enjoy the full view. But save it. Don't put it on display a few hours too early. A wedding is no place to be immodest. If anything, that would be the most chaste moment of your life as a bride. Why be giving the preacher and your husband, prospective husband, and the bride, the groomsmen and the bridesmaids and the whole audience a glimpse of things they don't have any right to be seeing except that man that you're marrying a few hours later? I just want to fit in, somebody says. I just want to be accepted. Well, we all do, don't we? I understand that drive as much as anybody does, but folks, are we going to sell our souls in order to fit in? Isn't that what Peter did in the garden when Jesus was being tried? And they said, you're one of those folks too, aren't you? What did he do? In order not to stick out like a sore thumb, in order to just blend in, he denied his Lord. Is that what we're going to do? Just to blend in like a chameleon to our society, even if we have to sell our Lord to do it? Surely fitting in is not that important. What I wear is nobody's business but my own, somebody says. Well, that's simply not true. A Christian could never say that his dress or his speech or anything else about his behavior is nobody else's business. We carry the Lord's name with us. And what we do either causes people to think higher or lower thoughts of the Lord that we presume to follow. And finally, somebody just says, well, it's a good lesson, Brother Henry, but it just doesn't apply to me. Glad you preached that for them, but I don't need it. I find that response with every sermon I ever preach. The people who really need it don't think it applies to them. You'd be amazed at the number of times in meetings that people are coming out, shaking my hand. They say, thanks for preaching that lesson, Brother Henry. These people in this congregation really needed that. I just want to say, what about you? That's who I was talking to, you. Well, if you don't know whether this lesson applies to you or not, ask somebody. Ask me, and I'll give you an honest appraisal, whether you're a wife or a daughter or a grandmother. I'll give you an honest male perspective on what the visual image of the clothes you wear has upon me. Our elders would be good people to ask about that, ladies, if you really honestly want to know whether this lesson applies to you or not. So let me conclude by making just a couple of comments about male leadership on modesty. Some advice to men. Number one, husbands and fathers, think and dress modestly yourself. You're not going to be able to give the help that I want you to give to your wives and your daughters if you dress immodestly. So clean up your act. And don't watch immodest entertainment on TV or in the movies or anyplace else. You're not going to have any credibility on this issue if your wife and your daughters know that for all of your talk, you enjoy watching other women immodestly clad. Do what Job said in Job 31, verse 1. Make a covenant with your eyes. Enter into a covenant with your eyes that your eyes will only look certain places. It'll be a difficult covenant to keep, but it's a good covenant to make. But finally, most importantly, husbands and fathers, I'm telling you, you need to teach your wives and daughters how this works. The reasons that our women and our young women don't understand this any more than they do is that they've never heard it taught to them either by their father or their husband. So step up to a realm of leadership, men, and explain how the world works in regard to this issue to the female members of your family. And to you, my dear sisters, I would simply say, number one, save yourselves for your husbands. Don't give any man even a faint hint or a preview of anything about your body that only your husband will have the right to see. Be able to give your husbands something that nobody else has ever seen or even thought about. And let it be a private thing between you and your husband. I'll tell you, ideal situations, whether you would be an absolute sexual tigress and nobody know about it but your husband. That's the way it ought to be. So save it for your husbands. And save yourselves for your Lord. Leave the world. Let yourself be set apart to belong to the Lord, and your conduct be totally governed by the restrictions of your Lord. Finally, save yourselves for heaven. Don't miss heaven by dressing in a way that gives you something you want in the meantime. Don't spoil your appetite for the feast by eating the worldly candy that might be available to you right now. You lose your soul, you're going to be mighty sorry that you didn't see what was most important. Now, I believe that it's nothing but the devil's lie that says we can't dress modestly and stylishly at the same time. Sometimes that's hard to do, but I don't believe it's anybody but the devil who would want you to think that you can't be modest and stylish at the same time. That's a lie. But let me tell you, even if it were true, the Christian's choice would have to be clear. If the Lord required you to wear a raincoat the rest of your life, if that's what it took to get to heaven, I'm telling you it'd be worth it doing it. I don't care how crazy people thought you were. Heaven's going to be worth whatever it takes to get there. Stylishness sometimes has to be sacrificed for a higher principle of modesty. And it might be an expensive sacrifice. It might be a costly sacrifice. If you have to replace much of your wardrobe, it'll be a very expensive sacrifice. And it might cost you some popularity in the people that are your peer group outside the Lord's people. But it'll be a sacrifice worth making. Do we only give the Lord that which costs us nothing? I hope that we're willing to give the Lord that which costs us dearly. And if you had to go to your closet this afternoon and throw away 2/3 of the garments that you most like, you could see that as a sacrifice, giving the Lord something that costs. And I'll tell you, you'd love the Lord more by having given something that really represented some sacrifice. Do we follow the Lord only as long as He doesn't stand between us and something we really want? I'm afraid that's about all the allegiance many of us have to the Lord. We say, yes, I'll follow the Lord. Yes, I'll do what's right, unless that keeps me from doing something I really want to do. Then I'll find a way to make an exception. Can we not make an unreserved commitment to the Lord because we love Him? And we are willing to give Him anything that we have up to the giving of our lives. Folks, we're not fooling anybody but ourselves if we say, oh, I'd lay down my life for the Lord, but yet I won't look a little bit dowdy or dorky for Him. Who are we kidding? He who is faithful in that which is least is faithful in that which is much. So, all of us have blind spots. I do, you do. It's hard to see ourselves objectively, isn't it? James says in James 3, verse 2, we all stumble in many ways. For that reason, I'm telling you, our salvation depends upon our willingness to be warned. Depending on what your reaction is when you hear a lesson like this that warns you, your salvation may well depend upon whether you're willing to be warned or not. Remember how it was in Hezekiah's day? We read this just a few days ago in our daily Bible reading, where Hezekiah wanted to bring the people back to the love of the Lord, and so he sent runners out all over the land to proclaim that things were going to be restored to the way the Lord had commanded them. 2 Chronicles 30, verse 10 says, they laughed at them and mocked them. A lot of people just thought it was pretty silly and went on their way disregarding the warnings that had been given to them, and they paid the price later. So I offer these thoughts to you with all humility. recognizing my own faults and failings, but sounding a warning that I believe needs to be sounded. Now finally, young people, Nate, you're not so young, but you're sitting on the front row, so we'll get in on this. Young men, young women, what worries me about the response to this lesson is that some of you may be on your way home in the car after this lesson is over and say, Dad, Mom, what about that lesson? And you may have parents who say, oh, Brother Henry's old and he's a preacher and he just doesn't know the way it is. If your parents say that, be advised that yes, I am old, and yes, I am a preacher, but I know what's going on. I'm not proud of it, but I've been around the block a few more times than the average preacher has. I know how the way the world works. If you don't believe me, ask Mike Roy. Before he obeyed the gospel, he was a salty sailor in the Navy, and he really knows how the world works. He'll tell you what I'm telling you is the truth. I'm shooting straight with you. Whether you do anything about it or not, it's going to indicate a lot about what kind of heart you have, what kind of character you have. So let yourself be warned. You respond to the warning with an open heart, make the appropriate changes, you'll be taking steps in God's direction. If, like most people, you laugh warnings off and say, that didn't apply to me, then you'll be taking some steps away from God. And don't do that.